Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor Brainard, thanks again for your continued willingness to continue in public service. I know this isn't always easy. I was encouraged to hear you say that you are committed to the independent and nonpartisan status of the Federal Reserve. It's very important that Fed decisions on monetary and regulatory policy are entirely free from political interference. So I think this is a simple yes or no question. Will you commit to considering yourself independent from the White House, regardless of which party occupies it?
Yes.
Thank you. And will you commit to make your decisions without regard to political or electoral consequences?
Yes.
Thank you. So I think you have acknowledged the importance of the independence of the Fed, how crucial that is for maintaining the trust and confidence of the American people. In light of that, I wonder if you could tell me how you view the coup by three men, including one who's serving on a term that expired 3 years ago, that forced out Jelena McWilliams, a well-respected regulator, from the once independent FDIC.
So I can't speak to the FDIC. I can tell you that I've enjoyed working with Jelena, continue to work with her, Jelena McWilliams, Chair McWilliams, on issues such as the Community Reinvestment Act. We have a very different institution, and it's a very collegial institution. It is nonpartisan. And I can tell you a little bit about how I work in that institution, just to give you a sense.
Well, I'm very limited on time here, so let me just, so I know you commented on Jelena McWilliams, and I appreciate that. And I do understand you'd have had a good working relationship with her. But I think I would suggest and ask you to reflect on what happened there, and I think it is relevant. The Fed, as you know, is also a multi-member agency. It has prided itself on operating free from political interference and following norms of governance for many years. That used to describe the FDIC, and unfortunately it doesn't anymore. And there are people on the left and in this administration who want the Fed to become more political, to become advocates for the causes and agenda that they support. And I have warned, and I'm concerned, that the Fed's dalliance with those issues, totally irrelevant to the dual mandate, will undermine the Fed's credibility and threaten its independence. And I think that's very important. Let me move on to climate risk. As you know, the Fed has consistently stated that there are two categories of climate-related financial risks. The first is physical risks, and the second is transition risks. Now, the actual data shows that physical risk, that is, actual severe weather events, do not threaten financial stability. This week, Chairman Powell said the possibility of financial stability disruptions from physical risks, quote, doesn't seem likely in the near term, end quote. Well, that's obvious. And there's a recent report from the New York Fed that backs this up. According to the report, weather disasters from the last quarter century had insignificant or small effects on U.S. banks' performance. So do you acknowledge that the likelihood of weather events leading to systemic risk during your term as Fed governor is virtually zero based on historical data?
So to be honest, I think it's very important for us just to understand potential implications of tail risks. Tail risks are risks that have very, very low probability of happening but have extreme damage. And of course, I wouldn't have expected us to need to study pandemics 5 years ago either. And yet a lot of our policymaking over the last 2 years has been really under the cloud of a very complicated set of economic conditions and financial risks associated with a natural event. So, it's our job just to be very attentive to potential risks to the financial system.
So here's my concern in this, and I am certainly not alone in this. The other risks, the actual evidence shows that there's no real physical risk. The transition risk, though, is real, and Chairman Powell explained the source of that. The source of transition risk is really government policy. And this is what's concerning. There are lots of risks out there. There could be a trade war with China. There could be geopolitical turmoil coming from a Russian invasion of Ukraine. We could have the government engage in shutdowns again in response to a pandemic, for instance. Actually, I would argue each of those poses a greater risk to the financial system than some sort of climate event which has never resulted in the failure of a major bank. But you haven't advocated doing stress tests around those other risks. The only one I know of that you have advocated is stress tests for the less likely risk, which is the climate-related risk. And the concern that many of us have is that this whole construct, unique to climate risk, even though it is really not a threat, certainly in the foreseeable future, to the financial system, it's all about a precursor for using the regulatory power of the Fed to direct capital away from politically disfavored industries. So Sarah Bloom Raskin is, by some accounts, might be President Biden's next nominee to be the vice chair for supervision. Now, she's been explicit on this point, and she has argued regarding the implementation of the CARES Act that the Fed, and I quote, should not be directing money to further entrench the carbon economy, end quote. So she's explicitly advocated that the Fed allocate capital by denying it to this disfavored sector. And my question is, do you agree with Ms. Raskin that the Fed should play that role?
So let me just respond to your question, Senator. Thanks for asking. I have not suggested that we should do stress tests for climate. Stress tests are very specific. They are related to the capital planning of large financial institutions. We do actually include geoeconomic risks in those stress tests, so we have included things like Brexit in our stress tests. But I certainly have not stated that we should do climate stress tests. In terms of supervisory guidance, what we tend to do is ask large institutions in particular, do you have a good risk management framework for assessing all of your material risks? We would not tell banks which sectors to lend to or which sectors to not lend to, but we do want to make sure that they are measuring, monitoring, and managing their material risks, and many large financial institutions.
So then, just to be clear, then you disagree with Ms. Raskin on this point?
So I honestly have not studied her positions, and I would simply say I can speak to what we do in our supervisory guidance. And, you know, it's pretty meat and potatoes. It is very well known to the large institutions, and not that, really not that different from what they're doing today. The one thing I would also just want to clarify is I don't think that's appropriate for small institutions. I think small institutions don't have as big a footprint. I think, you know, they'll decide what their risks are, but I'm really more focused on the large institutions who themselves come in to tell us that they'd like to have more consistent expectations in this area across jurisdictions.
I see you run out of time.
Thank you, Senator Toomey.